The Shaping of America, the Transcontinental Railroad. Hi, my name is Jake Hoffer. This is my midterm exam project for Professor Troutman's U.S. History from Reconstruction to Present course this fall. I decided on the topic of how the Transcontinental Railroad impacted America. My reasons for choosing this topic stem back to my childhood love of trains. When I was a kid, I didn't know the role they actually played in the world. So I chose this topic to learn how something I loved as a kid would shape the world that I live in today. The importance of the railroad. There was a time in the United States when commerce and commercial travel were hindered by the absence of an official form of transportation. To get to and from our east and west coast, you were given the option of sailing down to the Panama Canal or making the trip via a horse-drawn wagon, which could take up to 4 months. This lengthy process of travel was about to change, though. With the connection of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad, we saw the birth of something that would bring our country to a new height by drastically making improvements to our economy and our society. This essential building block of our nation would be known as the Transcontinental Railroad. As we take a second to look at this picture, we see people of all races, colors, genders, and ages. Some of these men are the ones who built the railroad, and some are the ones who funded it. This is a picture of the moment when the Central Pacific Railway and the Union Pacific Railway met. You can see the pride and joy in the people's faces as the two men in the background reach out to touch each other's hands, signaling the completion of the railroad. Who put in the work? The building of the Transcontinental Railroad would require an extreme amount of manual labor. The perceived thought of most people is that the work was done by that of Americans. But in reality, the vast majority of labor was done by that of immigrants. Initially, the railway companies employed mostly Irish immigrants, as well as some Americans. This would soon change. At the time, there was a large amount of Chinese immigrants on the West Coast who came during the gold rush, hoping of getting rich. The railway companies would start to employ these Chinese immigrants because of a certain skill that they possessed. That skill would be their expertise in explosives because of their country's use of explosives for hundreds of years. This skill was crucial in the construction of the railroad due to the terrain being filled with mountains. The work these immigrants were able to accomplish was extraordinary, and without them, the time frame and the quality in which the railroad was constructed wouldn't have been possible. Environmental impact. The creation of the Transcontinental Railroad took a heavy toll on our environment. The use of natural resources was extensive and would even leave some places changed forever. The two biggest environmental changes that resulted from the construction were the decimating of forests for lumber that was used to build the tracks, and the destruction of mountain ranges from explosives in order to create a path for the trains to go through. Connecting the West to the rest of the United States. With the joining of the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad, we were essentially connecting the western United States with the world, greatly aiding our economy as well as our society in the United States. The western U.S. had a vast supply of natural resources throughout their region, but it was difficult and expensive to bring those resources to our factories in the east. The Transcontinental Railroad would allow those resources to travel to those factories in a fraction of the time and for a fraction of the cost. This would greatly benefit industries like the meatpacking industry in Chicago, the steel industry in Pittsburgh and in New York, as well as the automotive industry in Detroit. Growing the West. The completion of the railroad didn't just have an impact on industries in the East. It would open up a whole new world of possibilities in the western United States. The other forms of technology used throughout the eastern cities is now able to be brought out west. This movement of technology would allow industries to expand and start the construction of the western United States. The Homestead Act would greatly aid in this growth of our country. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln, would provide land to people out west as long as they agreed to certain conditions. The conditions were they must live on it. This condition was issued to prevent mass owning of land by companies and wealthy landowners. The second condition being they must farm and improve the land. If they agreed to these conditions, they only had to pay a small fee to register for a grant of the land. This act would encourage settlement to more people out west. It would also spur economic growth and aid in building cities in the western United States. Growing California, the economy. California is a place where this growth would not just take off economically, but also socially. California was a place able to thrive economically due to multiple factors, like their large population of immigrants looking to build a new life. The people of California were able to take advantage of the natural resources in the area. The most important factor was the access of having multiple large ports along their coast. Having those ports in combination with the new construction of the railroad, they were perfectly set up to continue to grow, and the next step was building their society. As California's economy began to flourish, more and more people began to move out west. As the population increased in size, so did the cities. Everything was starting to take shape. This growth would lead to California being one of the wealthiest and most sought-after places to live in the United States today. Creation of the first time zones. At this time in history, people would set their clocks based on location of the sun. This meant most areas had their own local times that they would go by. This created a problem because the location of the sun is not the same spot in California as it is in New York at the same time. These times were generally all based off of high noon, or when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. Since there was such a big difference between time across the United States, it made train scheduling a logistic nightmare. The departure and arrival times were never accurate and merely speculation. A uniform way of keeping time needed to be created. Instead of using the government to come up with a solution, the wealthy railroad companies took it upon themselves to come up with a new system of keeping time. They divided the country into 4 zones. This would become the creation of the time zones we know today. Most importantly, it would allow the railway companies to keep a accurate schedule for arrival and departure time of trains. Overview. The joining of the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad would transform our country from a collection of regions into a united nation, creating the America that we know today. This America is the one the little boy in me knew and loved, but can now understand and appreciate how it was possible. These are my citations. This first slide of citations is the 4 citations that I found most crucial in my project. The first being an overview of why the Transcontinental Railroad needed to be built. The second was the effects of the Transcontinental Railroad's construction on our growing economy. The third being the Homestead Act and how it would shape life out in the West. The fourth is my JSTOR source. It helped me get information on why the Chinese immigrants played such a large role in our economy and building of the railroads. The first slide on this second is another JSTOR article. It helped me understand the need for railroads to be built all throughout our country. The second being more information on the effects the railroad had on our economy. The third being more information about the role that Chinese immigrants would play in the construction of the railroad. The fourth would illustrate multiple ways that the building of the railroad would impact our country. The last would help me understand how immigrants would create cities in different parts of our country. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed. And that is all.